Your father may have carried one. Your uncle almost certainly saw one. If you grew up watching black and white war movies on a Sunday afternoon television set, you knew its silhouette before you knew its name. The Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun, the Chicago typewriter. And in the summer of 1942, it went into a jungle that would break men who had never been broken and build a legend that was mostly a lie. The dawn came slow over Guadalcanal on August 7th, 1942. A gray Pacific mist clung to the water like something afraid to leave. Then the naval guns opened up. The horizon flashed white. Shells the size of refrigerators tore across the sky and slammed into the beach, and the jungle that had stood there for 10,000 years began to burn. Inside the landing craft, 11,000 men of the 1st Marine Division crouched shoulder to shoulder, vomiting into their helmets, praying or saying nothing at all. Most of them were 19, 20, 21 years old. Farm boys from Iowa, dock workers from Brooklyn, coal miners from West Virginia who had never seen an ocean until 3 months ago. And scattered among them, slung across chests and gripped in white-knuckled hands, was a weapon that did not belong in this century. It was heavy. It was ugly. It had wooden furniture that gleamed like a pool cue and a round drum magazine that looked like something a Chicago gangster would carry into a speakeasy, because that once was exactly what it had been. The Thompson submachine gun, 1928, Model A1, 10.5 pounds empty, 11.5 loaded. It fired a fat, slow 45 caliber bullet at roughly 830 feet per second, well below the speed of sound. And on this morning, in the hands of United States Marines, it was going into the worst kind of war it had ever seen. But to understand why the Thompson was here, on this beach, in this war, you have to go back. You have to go back to a trench in France that the gun never reached. 1918. General John Taliaferro Thompson, United States Army Ordnance, was 58 years old and running out of time. The war in Europe was grinding men into paste in muddy trenches, and Thompson had an idea. He called it a trench broom, a weapon light enough for one man to carry, fast enough to sweep an enemy trench clean in a single burst. Not a rifle. Something new, something that could put down a wall of lead at close range and clear 100 feet of earthworks in seconds. He worked on it through the summer of 1918. He tested it in the fall, and in November, the armistice was signed. The war ended. The trench broom had no trenches left to sweep. For 20 years, the Thompson gun wandered. The Army did not want it. It was too expensive. $200 apiece in 1921, when a Ford Model T sold for less than $400. So Thompson's company, Auto Ordnance, tried to sell it to whoever would buy: police departments, prison guards, the United States Postal Service, briefly, to protect mail trucks from bandits. And then Prohibition came. And the Thompson found a home it never asked for. Chicago, 1929. St. Valentine's Day. 7 men lined up against a garage wall on North Clark Street. 2 shooters in stolen police uniforms. And 2 Thompson submachine guns. 70 rounds fired in less than 30 seconds. The gun that had been designed to end trench warfare had become the most famous murder weapon in American history. The Tommy gun, the Chicago typewriter, the chopper. By the mid-1930s, when a young man in a small-town movie theater watched James Cagney spray a room full of rivals with a drum-fed Thompson, that was what the gun meant. It meant gangsters. It meant prohibition. It meant something dirty and American and doomed. The United States Marine Corps was watching too, but the Marines were not looking at Cagney. They were looking at what the gun could do. In 1940 and 1941, as the war in Europe widened and the shadow of Japan lengthened across the Pacific, a strange thing happened inside the Corps. The Marines wanted Thompsons badly, but the United States Army had first claim on every Thompson coming off the auto ordnance line. And there were not enough to go around. So the Marines improvised. They bought them wherever they could find them. Some came from the FBI. Some came from state police armories. Some were purchased directly, one at a time, from auto ordnance through back channels and personal favors. A gun that had been built to sweep a French trench that had killed bootleggers in Chicago alleys was now being hoarded piece by piece by an American military service preparing for a war in the jungles of the South Pacific. And 2 men, more than any others, understood exactly what they wanted to do with it. The first was Colonel Merritt Edson. They called him Red Mike. He was 45 years old, small and thin and sharp as a wire, with pale blue eyes and a voice that never rose above conversational, even when he was ordering men to their deaths. Edson had fought in Nicaragua, chasing Sandinistas through the jungle. He knew what close combat in dense terrain looked like. He knew that a rifle was often useless when the enemy was 10 feet away, hidden in the leaves, screaming. Edson would command the 1st Raider Battalion. His men would carry Thompsons. The second man was different. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson was 46 years old, tall and gaunt, with a face like a Baptist preacher and the eyes of a man who had seen too many things too closely. He had spent time in China, embedded with Mao Zedong's 8th Route Army in 1937 and 1938. He had watched Chinese guerrillas fight the Japanese with almost nothing, and he had learned something that no other American officer had learned. He had learned the fire team. 3 men, one with a rifle for aimed fire, one with a Browning automatic rifle for suppression, and one with a Thompson submachine gun for close-in devastation. A small, self-contained killing unit built around 3 weapons that covered every range from muzzle to 200 yards. Carlson brought that idea home. and when he was given command of the 2nd Raider Battalion in early 1942, he built his entire force around it. His men called him Uncle Evans. They chanted his slogan on the training fields at Camp Elliott: Gung Ho, Chinese for work together. Nobody in the Marine Corps had ever heard anything like it. Some of the senior officers thought Carlson was a communist. Some thought he was a lunatic. Some thought both. None of them would say it to his face. By August of 1942, both battalions were ready, and so were the Thompsons. Now, back to the beach. The mist was burning off. The naval barrage had lifted. The landing craft ground into the black volcanic sand of Guadalcanal, and the ramps dropped, and 11,000 young Americans stepped onto an island most of them could not have found on a map 3 weeks earlier. The Japanese had fled inland. The initial landing was almost bloodless. Marines pushed through coconut plantations, past abandoned construction equipment, past half-eaten bowls of rice, still warm on wooden tables. They took the airfield the Japanese had been building and renamed it Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. And then the real war began, because Guadalcanal was not going to be a landing. It was going to be a siege, 6 months of it. The Japanese would come back and come back and come back again. And the men on the ground would learn very quickly that the Pacific War was not going to look like anything they had trained for. The rifles they carried, the beautiful new M1 Garands, were long and accurate and designed to kill a man at 400 yards. But in the jungle of Guadalcanal, a man could not see 400 yards. He could not see 40. Sometimes he could not see 14. The fighting, when it came, would come at knife range. In the dark, in the rain, in vines so thick a man could reach out and touch the enemy without extending his arm. And in that world, some of the Marines were about to discover something the generals had not planned for, that the ugly, obsolete 20-year-old gangster gun slung across their backs might be the only thing standing between them and the men coming out of the trees. But the Thompson had a secret, too. Something nobody talked about in the training films. Something the recruiting posters did not mention. Something that would take a battle called Makin and a sergeant named Thomason and 9 men left behind on an island to reveal. Because in 11 days, on August 17th, 1942, 2 American submarines were going to surface off a coral atoll 2,000 miles to the north. 211 Marine raiders were going to paddle rubber boats through a pounding surf in the dark, and the first Marine Medal of Honor of the Second World War was going to be won and lost and paid for in blood by a man carrying a Thompson submachine gun. His name was Clyde Thomason. He was 28 years old. He had been a corporal in the peacetime Marines, gotten out, worked as a merchant seaman, come back after Pearl Harbor, and taken a demotion to private just to get into the Raiders. Now he was a sergeant again. He was tall, quiet, from Atlanta, Georgia. He had a soft southern voice and the kind of steadiness under pressure that other men gravitated toward without knowing why. He was going to die on a beach in the Gilbert Islands with a Thompson in his hands. And what happened to the 9 raiders who did not make it back to the submarines that night would become one of the darkest and most deliberately buried secrets of the entire Pacific War. That story is coming. But first, we have to talk about Colonel Edson and a place the Marines would call, forever after, Bloody Ridge. We have to talk about the 12th of September, 1942. A single line of exhausted raiders, a muddy spine of coral and grass overlooking Henderson Field, and 3,000 Japanese soldiers moving through the dark toward them, bayonets fixed, orders given, screaming. We have to talk about what a Thompson submachine gun sounds like at 3 in the morning in the rain, when the men firing it have not slept in 4 days, and the men coming at them are close enough to smell. We have to talk about the myth, and we have to talk about what the myth got wrong. Because the story the American public would be told about Guadalcanal, the story Hollywood would tell in 1943 and 1945 in films that made the Thompson into a legend, was not quite the story the men who were actually there would have told. It was cleaner, it was louder, it was more heroic, and it left things out. It left out Clyde Thomason bleeding into the coral sand at Makin. It left out the 9 men who never came home and what the Japanese did to them on Kwajalein in October of 1942. It left out the fact that the enemy captured Thompsons too and used them right back. It left out the numbers, the cold Ordnance Department numbers, that would eventually rank the Thompson 4th in effectiveness behind 3 other American weapons that nobody made movies about. The gun's reputation, the historian Tom Lemlin once wrote, arrived before the gun did. On this beach, on this morning, on the 7th of August, 1942, the reputation was still forming. The men were still walking inland through the coconut palms. The Japanese were still hidden in the hills, watching, counting, waiting for night. And the Thompson, the trench broom that never saw a trench, the gangster gun that had come to war at last, was about to be tested in the worst kind of ground it had ever known. The jungle was quiet. For now, 10 days after the landing on Guadalcanal, while Marines on that island were still digging in and waiting for the first Japanese counterattack, 2 American submarines broke the surface of the Black Pacific 2,000 miles to the north. The USS Nautilus, the USS Argonaut, old boats, big boats, slow boats built between the wars, now converted to carry men instead of torpedoes, and packed inside their steel hulls, breathing recycled air and vomiting into buckets for the past 9 days, were 211 United States Marine raiders, Colonel Evans Carlson's men. Their target was a coral atoll called Makin in the Gilbert Islands. A dot on the map, a Japanese seaplane base with maybe 160 defenders. The mission was simple on paper. Land at night, kill the garrison, destroy the radio station, take prisoners, gather intelligence, get out before dawn. The mission was not simple in the water. The surf came in high and hard that night. Rubber boats flipped. Outboard motors flooded and died. Men swam through the dark with rifles held over their heads, salt water in their eyes, coral cutting their boots to ribbons. By the time they reached the beach, half the raiders were on the wrong stretch of sand, and their weapons were half drowned, and the Japanese knew they were coming. Sergeant Clyde Thomason was 28 years old that night. Tall, quiet, from Atlanta. He had a Thompson submachine gun slung across his chest and a voice that other men followed without thinking about why. When the firing started, Thomason walked into it standing up. He moved along the front of his platoon in the open, calling out targets, waving men forward, drawing fire onto himself. So his raiders could see where the Japanese guns were hidden in the palms. He fired the Thompson in short, controlled bursts. 3 rounds, 5 rounds, never the full magazine, because a full magazine meant a muzzle climb no man could hold down. A Japanese sniper found him from a treetop, 1 shot, through the head. Thomason was dead before he hit the coral. He would become the first United States Marine of the Second World War to be awarded the Medal of Honor. He would never know it. His mother would receive the medal in a small ceremony in Georgia the following year, and she would not speak for a long time afterward. The raiders killed the garrison. They burned the radio station. They destroyed 2 seaplanes that landed during the fight, thinking the base was still friendly. And then, in the confusion of the withdrawal, in the dark, in the surf that had already killed men on the way in, something happened that the United States Navy would spend the rest of the war trying not to talk about. 9 raiders were left behind on the beach. The submarines pulled away in the pre-dawn dark. The head count was wrong. The paperwork was wrong. The chaos of the extraction had swallowed 9 men, alive, uninjured, standing on a beach in enemy territory, watching their own submarines disappear beneath the waves. They tried to survive. For days they hid in the palms, ate coconuts, drank rainwater. Eventually, the Japanese found them. They were shipped to the atoll of Guadalcanal. They were interrogated. And in mid-October of 1942, on the orders of Vice Admiral Koso Abe, they were taken out to a clearing and beheaded, one at a time, with a sword. Their families were told they were missing in action. The truth would not come out until after the war, when Admiral Abe was tried at Guam in 1947 and hanged for the murders. That was the first horror. The one that never made the newsreels, the one the Thompson gun could not save 9 men from, because a gun is only a piece of steel. and Steele does not remember who it belonged to. Meanwhile, back on Guadalcanal, another Marine was preparing for a different kind of night. Colonel Merritt Edson, Red Mike, 45 years old, pale eyes, quiet voice. By early September of 1942, Edson had 840 men on a low, grass-covered ridge south of Henderson Field. It was a ridge that ran like a spine through the jungle, and it was the last natural defense between the Japanese and the airfield. That was the entire reason the Americans had come to this island in the first place. If Henderson Field fell, Guadalcanal fell. Coming toward Edson through the jungle were more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. Veterans, elite troops, men who had marched 30 miles through primary jungle with no food and no water to make this attack, and who now believed they were about to sweep the Americans into the sea. The Japanese came at night, September 12th, September 13th, September 14th. 3 nights of it. They came in waves, screaming, bayonets fixed. They came out of ravines and up the ridge in the rain and the dark, and the Marines on top of the hill fired until their rifle barrels smoked, and their Thompsons ran dry, and their fingers cramped on the triggers. Here is where the myth was born. The story that would be told in newsreels and magazine articles and eventually Hollywood films was that the Thompson submachine gun broke the Japanese charge on Edson's Ridge, that the .45 caliber slug at close range in the rain cut down Banzai attackers by the hundreds. The truth is smaller. The truth is that most of the Japanese dead on that ridge were killed by something else entirely. They were killed by the 105th millimeter howitzers of the 11th Marines firing from behind Henderson Field, dropping shells with such precision that some of them landed within 30 yards of Edson's own men. They were killed by the M1917 water-cooled machine guns, 30 caliber, feeding from cloth belts. That Marine gun teams kept running through the entire night by pouring canteen water and their own urine into the cooling jackets when the water ran out. They were killed by the Browning automatic rifles that were the real backbone of the Marine fire team. The Thompson was there. The Thompson killed men. But the Thompson did not win Edson's Ridge. The artillery won Edson's Ridge. The machine guns won Edson's Ridge. Cold steel won Edson's Ridge in the last hours when the Japanese got close enough to grapple hand-to-hand in the mud. Post-battle Marine Corps assessments would later attribute the majority of Japanese casualties on the ridge to artillery fire, but you would not know that from the newspapers back home. Back home, the story was the Tommy gun, because the Tommy gun was familiar. The Tommy gun was Cagney. The Tommy gun was something an American in Peoria could picture in his head, could see in a movie, could understand. A 105 howitzer 6 miles behind the line was invisible. A Thompson in a Marine's hands Spitting fire in the rain was a story, and so the story is what people got. There was another thing they did not get. By September of 1942, the Thompson was already in Japanese hands. The Imperial Army had captured hundreds of Thompsons in the Philippines earlier that year when American and Filipino forces surrendered on Bataan and Corregidor. They had captured more from the raiders at Makin. And now, on Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers occasionally came up out of the jungle, carrying American Thompsons of their own, firing American .45 caliber ammunition back at American Marines. The gun that the newsreels called an American terror weapon was quietly a weapon both sides used. There was more the newsreels did not say. They did not say that the Thompson, at 10.5 pounds empty, was brutal on a Marine humping it through the jungle in 100-degree heat. They did not say that the drum magazine, the round 50-round drum that was the gun's iconic feature, rattled when a man walked. Rattled loud enough to give away an ambush position. The Marines quietly stopped using the drums within weeks of landing on Guadalcanal. 20-round and 30-round box magazines only. The Gangster look was retired in the field, though it would live forever in Hollywood. They did not say that the Thompson cost the American taxpayer roughly $200 a gun in the early years of the war, at a time when an M1 Garand rifle cost about $85. Ordnance Department engineers were already redesigning the weapon by 1942, stripping out the finely machined parts, replacing them with stamped steel. The result was the M1 and M1A1 Thompson, cheaper, uglier, functionally identical in a fight, and produced by the million. And they did not say, though a young Army lieutenant named John George would say it clearly in a book published in 1947, that the Thompson in the jungle had a real weakness. George was 27 years old when he arrived on Guadalcanal in December of 1942 with the American Division. He was a competitive rifle shooter before the war, an expert on small arms, and he wrote down what he saw with an honesty that most veterans never allowed themselves. He wrote that the Thompson at close range was devastating. He agreed with that part. But he wrote that the .45 caliber slug, slow and heavy, did not chop through jungle vegetation the way the myth claimed. He wrote that thick vines and green bamboo stopped it, deflected it, tumbled it. He wrote that the Thompson was too heavy for long patrols, too complex for the mud, too thirsty for ammunition when a firefight ran long. The Thompson was a tool, a good tool for a specific job, nothing more. But the myth was already loose in America, and the myth would outlive every man who had ever picked up the gun and used it in anger on Guadalcanal. The killing on the island went on into February of 1943. 6 months of it. Malaria, dysentery, starvation on the Japanese side, combat fatigue on the American side, men going home at 90 pounds, men not going home at all. And when the last Japanese destroyer slipped away from Cape Esperance in the first week of February, carrying the last 10,000 ragged survivors of the Imperial Army off the island, something had ended. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. But the story of the Thompson submachine gun and what it really was and what it was not was only beginning to be told honestly. That reckoning was still coming, and so was the price the men who used it would pay long after the guns went silent. February 9th, 1943. Guadalcanal was quiet, not silent. Nothing on that island was ever silent. The insects still screamed in the trees. The rain still came in the afternoons. Somewhere in the hills, a wounded Japanese soldier the searchers had not found was probably still dying, alone, of hunger. But the guns had stopped. The last Imperial destroyers had slipped away from Cape Esperance in the first week of February, running dark, carrying 10,000 starving ghosts back to Rabaul. The Japanese called it Operation KE. They called it a strategic redeployment. It was a retreat, the first one the Imperial Army had made in the Pacific War. The cost, when the accountants finally sat down with the paper, was staggering. Roughly 7,100 American dead, wounded, or missing. 1,600 of them killed outright. On the Japanese side, roughly 19,200 killed in combat, and another 12,000 who did not die in combat at all. They died of starvation, of dysentery, of malaria in the rotting green dark. Some of them ate leaves. Some of them ate each other. There are official Imperial Army records that describe this in bureaucratic language, and the language is worse than any photograph. The men who had used the Thompson on Guadalcanal, the raiders and the riflemen and the machine gun crews, went home in stages over the following year. Most of them weighed 20 or 30 pounds less than when they had arrived. Some of them had malaria that would come back every year for the rest of their lives, fever and shaking and cold sweats in a warm American bedroom 40 years after the war. And the Thompson gun went with them in a way, because Hollywood had been watching. In 1943, while the war was still going on, 20th Century Fox released a film called Guadalcanal Diary. In 1945, Warner Brothers released Pride of the Marines, the story of Al Schmid, a Marine machine gunner blinded by a Japanese grenade at the Tanaru River on Guadalcanal in August of 1942. And in film after film through the rest of the decade and into the 1950s, the Thompson submachine gun appeared in the hands of American heroes on movie screens across the country. It appeared clean. It appeared reliable. It appeared to sweep the jungle clear of Japanese soldiers with a single burst. The gun on the screen was not the gun on the island. The gun on the island had jammed sometimes, had rattled when the drums were loaded, had weighed too much on a long patrol, had According to the Marine Corps Ordnance Department's own post-war assessments, ranked fourth in effectiveness behind the M1 Garand rifle, the Browning automatic rifle, and the M919 medium machine gun. But the gun on the screen was the gun America remembered. And that was the last twist. The one that outlived everyone. Because a myth, once it takes root in a country, does not need the truth to keep growing. The Thompson had been famous before it ever saw a jungle. Prohibition had made it famous. Chicago had made it famous. Hollywood had made it famous. A second time in the war, and the second fame was even bigger than the first. 25 years later, in the rubble of Hugh in 1968, an American Marine captain would find an old Thompson lying in a pile of debris and pick it up and carry it into a house-to-house fight against North Vietnamese regulars. Because he had grown up watching those movies, because he believed what they told him. The Thompson would fight in Vietnam because of what America believed the Thompson had done at Guadalcanal. And what America believed was only half true. The men who had actually been there mostly did not talk about it. Colonel Merritt Edson, Red Mike, the small, quiet man of Bloody Ridge, came home to a career in the peacetime Marine Corps and rose to Major General. He retired in 1947. He worked in politics briefly. He tried to run a shooting sports organization. And on the evening of August 14th, 1955, in the garage of his home in Washington, D.C., he ran a hose from the exhaust pipe of his car to the interior, closed the door, and died. He was 58 years old. The Marine Corps recorded the cause of death and closed the file. Depression, they said. Something that had come home from the war with him and had never left. Colonel Evans Carlson, Uncle Evans, the tall, gaunt man who had learned the fire team from Mao's guerrillas in China, did not live long enough to see the myth take full hold. He had been wounded on Saipan in June of 1944. His health was never right again after that. And in the post-war years, when Senator Joseph McCarthy began looking for communists in the American military, Carlson's name came up. His time in China came up. His slogan, Gung Ho, was called suspicious. His fire team doctrine was called foreign. Carlson died of a heart attack on May 27th, 1947. He was 51. The men he had trained wept openly at the funeral. They had known him. They had followed him through the surf at Makin. Sergeant Clyde Thomason, 28 years old, of Atlanta, Georgia, first Marine Medal of Honor recipient of the Second World War, was buried in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. His mother received his medal in a small ceremony. She did not remarry. She did not speak of him publicly. Lieutenant John George, the young rifle expert who had written the honest book about small arms in the Pacific, went on to serve in Korea. He died in the 1960s. His book, Shots Fired in Anger, is still in print. It is still the most honest thing an American ever wrote about the Thompson gun in combat. And then there is Gordon Rotman. Rotman was born in 1947. He was too young for Guadalcanal, too young for Korea, but he served with the 5th Special Forces group in Vietnam. And after the war, he became one of the most respected small arms historians in the English language. He wrote a book about the Thompson submachine gun. He interviewed men who had carried it in every theater from Sicily to the Solomons to the Mekong Delta. His conclusion was simple. The Thompson, he wrote, was a tool. It was good at some things and bad at others. It killed men at close range with authority. It failed at longer ranges. It was too heavy for a jungle patrol. It was too complex for the mud. Its ammunition ran out too quickly in a sustained fight. It was not a legend. It was a gun. The legend was something Americans had built around the gun in movie theaters and pulp magazines and newsreels because Americans needed heroes in 1942, and a Thompson in a Marine's hands was easier to film than a howitzer 6 miles behind the line. That is the honest verdict. But there is one thing more. Because the men who carried the Thompson on Guadalcanal, when they became old men, when they sat on porches in the 1980s and the 1990s and told their grandsons about the war, did not usually talk about the gun at all. They talked about the rain. They talked about the friend who died in the ravine below Edson's ridge, whose name they never forgot. They talked about the smell of the jungle after a firefight, which was a smell no movie had ever captured and no book had ever fully described. They talked about coming home on a hospital ship and seeing the coast of California for the first time in 2 years and not being able to speak for an hour. They did not talk about the Thompson because the Thompson was not the horror of Guadalcanal. The Thompson was a piece of steel that some of them had carried and some of them had used and some of them had left behind in the mud when they were medivaced out with malaria. The horror was everything else. The horror was the dark. The horror was the wet. The horror was the sound a man made when a bayonet found him at 3 a.m. in the rain, and the way that sound stayed inside the men who heard it for the rest of their lives. The horror was the 9 raiders on WWII kneeling in a clearing in October of 1942, waiting for a sword. The horror was Colonel Edson in a garage in 1955, closing the door. The horror was never the gun. The gun was only the thing the country chose to remember, because a gun is easier to remember than a man, and a legend is easier to sell than the truth. The Thompson submachine gun served in the United States military until 1971, when the last of them were finally struck from the arsenal lists. Nearly 1.7 million were made. Some of them are still out there, in museum cases, in private collections, in evidence lockers, in attics. But the men who carried them on Guadalcanal are almost all gone now, and the ridge is quiet, and the jungle has grown back over everything.